I don't know where my phone is. Oh, no.
And the room quiets. Thank you and welcome all. This is our third Tahoe friendly class in a series of 4 that we're offering. If this is your first time attending, never fear, we are going to recap the last class before we move on to tonight's topic, which is Tahoe friendly garden design. So I'm here. I'm Jennifer Cressy, and I'm the water efficiency technician for South Tahoe Public Utility District. I love my job. I get to go to people's homes and talk about gardening. And if you're not in our water district and sewer district, you get to come to classes like this where we can have fun and talk about gardening as well. So thank you for coming from Nevada or from the West Slope. Kathy is joining me. She's my fellow master gardener volunteer from the University of California Cooperative Extension. And she's also a landscape designer, so I'm going to lean on her heavily. I'm going to be sticking to the nuts and the bolts, but I think we make a good team, and I hope you guys enjoy yourself tonight. We will be recording the session, so we'll be able to share that with people who have missed the session. And I will also send out a PDF of the presentation. And so if it's important to provide your email address if you want to get additional resources also from this class that we refer to. The bathrooms are just on the right. If you go out this door, they're just on the left. And the water fountain is there. There's also some cups, and Drink Tahoe Tap is delicious. We have some free collapsible water bottles on the back table as well.
Sorry, Jen.
That's okay. I couldn't do this without Lauren. She's our water conservation specialist at South Tahoe Public Utility District. She's part of a team of 4 in the Water Conservation and Public Affairs Department. Thank you, Lauren. So the Tahoe Friendly Garden is the theme of the series, and it's a way of gardening that fits living in Tahoe, growing in Tahoe. It contributes to our ecosystem instead of deters from it, and protects water quality while saving water. And it always integrates defensible space in the decisions that we make. It's really important here in Tahoe, as we all understand. So backing up to the last class, I want to just do a brief overview of what the whole series is going to address. So we analyzed the site, we identified opportunities and challenges for our properties in the last class, we delineated our activity zones, and we then connected all those spaces that we identified, whether it be, and I'm going to go into it in a little bit more detail. And then today we're going to talk about those garden spaces that are left over. So before it was general landscape, like the whole lot. And after you decide where you really want to focus your gardening, that's what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about how you group plants by water need, called hydrozoning. Also looking at putting the right plants in the right place, because you're looking at sunlight requirements as well, what kind of soil those plants thrive in. Native plants are always an awesome choice because they are adapted to our climate. So we'll be talking about climate, microzones, and then some special interests that you might want to include in your landscape. And then selecting specific plants. We'll have, since you will be getting the slides, the pictures of plants that we have mostly will have the name on there. So you don't have to be as furiously writing notes. And you can always contact me with questions afterwards if you missed something about a plant, because we go off script all the time. Sorry. That's what you can expect. We have fun together. And then the last class, which is going to be August 22nd, that's going to be on now how to irrigate those planting areas that we're going to talk about today. So an overview of the site analysis plan. If you haven't brought one with you from the last class, you'll have an opportunity to work on that at the very end of the class. We'll be here to help you. with some cheat sheet notes up on the screen. But basically, it's identifying all those permanent structures on your landscape and the features that you want to keep. Whether, I mean, some trees aren't permanent, right? But you want to keep it. Stuff like retaining walls, boulders, slopes, your shed, for example, the vegetation you want to keep. And then you kind of look at it more deeply and you start analyzing, like, what are the challenges? I went to somebody's house yesterday, Jim, and he's not here tonight because he's at a safety event. But I looked at his landscape and I went, wow, this is so awesome. You have this beautiful mature tree that is giving you shade in this otherwise very hot and dry environment. And he goes, oh, you think that's a good thing? I'm like, and you've got these boulders and you've got such great bones, you have, a nice flat yard. It's going to be easy to garden in and create topography if you want. So what he thought was a challenge, I was looking at it as an opportunity. So it's really, as we learn more and experiment more, we learn from doing, and the more time that we spend in our landscape and think about it differently. The first class was like rethinking your lawn. Then you start to identify, okay, shade, maybe that shade is good. That sun is challenging. It takes a lot of water. So some of the bullets on this, I really want to maintain that view, or I want to block that view. That view is going to be gone in 5 years when those Jeffrey pines have grown, 2-3 feet a year. Just stuff like that. You want to think about maybe mitigating noise or preserving noise, making noise. You want to think about, drainage. Is there a lot of runoff or run through, or places, that are just unique and different? Like, can you make that work for you? Does that low spot, you want to turn it into a rain garden, where the soil stays moist longer? It's a challenge and sometimes an opportunity. Of course, always looking at snow storage, your erosion control practices that are required for the TRPA, and wildfire hazards. So because mitigating those hazards and following our rules and responsibilities here, being stewards of Lake Tahoe, I did put the slide in because you'll get a copy of it after the presentation, so you don't have to write down the websites. But we always encourage people to keep in mind defensible space, erosion control practices, and how our landscape planning could change our coverage on our property. So those are links to websites, including the bottom one will take you to a page, Living with Fire website, that has links for scheduling defensible space inspections for all the different fire districts where you may live. And we also talked about doing a defensible space inspection was a really good first step before planning. Because after you do that, your site might change, your sun might change, your views might change. So that's a good place to start. And then at the end of the class, was it 2 weeks ago, we said, okay, we gave you all this background information, and then we took you through a simple 5-step process. Really simple. It was developed by a conservation service in Jordan, Utah. And I went to this webinar and I thought, oh, this is fantastic. I just loved it. So I want to give them credit. But it is approach where instead of looking at plants in the nursery and going, I love those, I want to take all of those home and I want to put them in my garden. And then they sit in the pots and they get stressed and you don't know where to put them and you don't have your irrigation set yet. You don't have, your soil delivered yet. And you don't have a plan yet. So this kind of is a reverse triangle of landscape planning than what we're usually tempted to do. I'm tempted to do. I have to stay away from the nursery unless I have a plan. So it talked about identifying first your central open spaces. Because having like a place for your eye to rest is really important in landscape design, as Kathy will probably talk about more. It's a place that it could often it's grass. But if we're looking at water conservation, it could be that you have a whole front yard full of grass and then you reduce it to something that's easy to manage. Put it in the place where the grass grows nicely anyway, instead of fighting that place where you have root competition, where you have, really a lot of heat and sun from being on the corner of the street and the driveway. But it could be other materials as well. It could be a patio. It could be a bark mulch place where you have your lounge chairs, where your swing set is. But it is a central open space that contrasts all the planting around, which makes the planting around even more enjoyable, as designers say. And then you also consider, the second step is to consider your gathering spaces. And that is sometimes the same as the central open space. So, for example, I use my front lawn, which was reduced from a full front lawn in the yard to like an oval shape. I use it for gathering with my friends and neighbors in the front yard in the afternoons because that's shady and it's cool from irrigation. It's lovely. And it's not, I don't live on a busy street. So it also functions as a gathering space for me too. But that could be that you could have small rooms at all different places in your landscape where you might be chasing the sun or chasing the shade or wanting someplace more private or someplace more public where you get together with different size groups. And then the third step was like looking at activity zones, and activities could be passive or they could be more active. It could be where you have your vegetable garden and your potting table, or it could be where you store everything in that back corner. It could be where you hide your waste receptacles. It could be where you store your paddle boards and bicycles, and there's lots of different activity zones, but being that you need to plant a space for them. You can't just make your whole yard just this beautiful Bouchard gardens, because we live in our yards, right? We have other uses for them besides just beauty. And then after you've identified all those different areas in your yard, and you take your time, but it's fun to play around with different concepts. You want to connect the spaces with pathways, and those pathways can often be really great opportunities for creating visual interest, because your eye wants to follow the pathways. Also for like disconnecting fuel. Let's say you're using a flammable mulch. It could be made of a material that doesn't convey wildfire along the surface of your property to the next flammable source. And they're very low maintenance. So patios, low maintenance. Paths, low maintenance. I mean, the garden area, okay, higher maintenance. So that's what we're left with, is the planting areas. So that's what we're going to focus on again today. And there's ways of making that area less labor intensive, depending on what you want. So now, Kathy, for a few slides, you're going to talk about plant selection, because now we're to the good part.
The fun part.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, Kathy, being the landscape designer, if you just walked in here, you should know that.
So once you've made all of those decisions in the 5-step landscape design process, what you finally get to looking at choosing the right plant for the right place. And we'll look at 10. These are 10 criteria. I'm going to do a brief overview and then go into more detail with each of these criteria to help you choose plants that will be Tahoe plants, or we call Tahoe plants, and that will do very well here. You want to make sure, of course, that the plants you choose actually are going to grow here. And we do that by looking at the USDA and Sunset climate zones. The nurseries here, the local nurseries, are really very good at carrying trees, shrubs, and perennials that thrive here in Tahoe. So if you're familiar with Tahoe Outdoor Living, on Highway 89, and not too far from them is Aspen Hollow. Those are two real good choices here to look for plants. The folks there are really very knowledgeable. And so if you go further up to Tahoe City, there's, I think it's still called Tahoe Tree Company, right? Oh, yes. Okay, great. I just know where it is. I don't always look at what the name is anymore. But anyway, they're very knowledgeable as well. And a little bit further up in Truckee is the Villager, which is also an excellent nursery. The owners are extremely knowledgeable about all of the ways to use it. And they have the three, I guess, three of those nurseries have really nice demonstration gardens. And they all are knowledgeable about native plants as well, which we'll be talking about a little bit more. Jen has talked or will talk a little bit about hydrozoning, sun exposure. How much sun do you have? How much shade do you have? And what are the microclimates in your garden, which are places where you may have a different amount of sun or a different amount of cold or a different amount of shade than in the major part of your garden. And you need to take that into consideration too. And those another thing that I like to look at is, of course, the use of native and adapted plants, and also which plants bloom for a long period of time, or which plants bloom only in the spring or only in the summer or only have interest in the fall. I like to use a combination of plants that extend the season and also have seasonal interests. Like the most obvious is autumn color, which we look for up here. Also, you need to you want to decide whether you want to plant a garden that provides habitat, particularly for birds and pollinators. And the last thing, Jen will be talking about spacing, how the spacing of the plants is very important in your final product, your mature garden, but also in the style of garden that you choose to have. So let's look a little more deeply into, okay, the climate zone. The United States Department of Agriculture has divided the country into various regions that they define by the lowest temperature. We are in the USDA zone 6B or 7A, which has extremes of -10 to -20. Now, typically, Tahoe's extremes don't go that low. They're usually, let me see, what is it, 12 to 22, I think. But then we also have the Sunset Garden, Western Sunset Gardens. Some of you may be familiar with the Western Garden book. There's a whole section in the front that shows the various planting zones in the western states. They're much more detailed or comprehensive in how they define the zones. And I usually try to go by Sunset because they seem more comprehensive. But the thing of it is, labels in nurseries often only use the USDA zone, so it's important to know what those zones are and what the temperature extremes are. Okay. Right.
Question real quick.
Sure.
On the USDA zone,
Uh-huh.
does that hyphen mean it goes from 6B, EDEFGH, blah, 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 up to 7A?
Yes, that's correct.
So it has this.
So it's within that range.
Right.
And then you want to look at microclimates because, for example, we call the East Shore the banana belt. They hardly get any snow, whereas Myers and out in that direction gets a lot of snow. So where you live is going to depend on where within that framework you are.
Right in the middle.
You're right in the middle?
Yeah,
There you go. Okay. All right. So always ask at the nursery too, where the plant you have fallen in love with might fit in whatever microclimate in your garden you want to put the plant. We also have, in addition to using the climate zones as a guideline, we also have to consider cool nights and arid summers. That's why we're called a Mediterranean climate, because our summers are basically rainless. It used to be regularly we would have thunderstorms in August, starting at 2 o'clock, but everything is sort of topsy-turvy now, so that's not quite the way it is. But we often have 30-degree swings between daytime and nighttime temperature, which is going to affect the health and the growth rate of the plants we choose.
I was going to say that soil temperature stays cold longer after getting cool at night. So the amount of time the plant has to grow is.
Yeah, that's why when you see a range in a catalog of like this plant will be, this shrub will be 4 feet to 6 feet, usually look at the lowest height, because it's not going to have as much time to grow here as it might in a place where the soil is warmer longer. We also can expect snow in summer. How many, I can't tell you before the gophers got the tulips, how many times they were in the snow, We have a very drying winds, and if you live in the Keys, you've got more wind than just about anybody else. And depending on the orientation of your house and the direction the wind blows, you might, have a very windy site. And that's really going to make a difference in the plants you choose. Cold sinks are also something we need to consider. For example, on your property, there's probably always one place where the snow lasts the longest, and that would be known as a cold sink, right? It might be behind a fence or on the north side of your property.
Or the lowest spot where the cold sinks. So if you're down by the airport meadow, it's like 8 degrees colder than on the ridge road right above it where I live. So it's just low parts in your property and the low parts in the landscape. Meadows.
Thank you. Okay. And also, some of you, depending on where you live again, may have seasonally high groundwater, and you might maybe you have a swale that retains water longer in the season than anywhere else on your property. And that might suggest that you have like rain. What is that called, Jen?
Oh, it's a great opportunity for a rain garden.
For a rain garden, right? Rather than seeing it as a challenge or a deficit, you could consider it an opportunity to experiment with different plants. Jen is now.
Oh yeah, so we're talking about water now. Of course, here I am.
She's a mermaid.
Oh, that too. I work in water. I love being in water. I used to work with water and recreation. So yeah, water is in my blood. So planning our garden beds, right? Back to that. So there's going to be areas where you might want like some curbside appeal, and you pick a spot like out by the street, but that's maybe a hot and sunny spot. So you're going to be irrigating that on a different irrigation zone and selecting plants that like that condition versus the area by your front door, where there's like a lot of impact, because every day when you come home, you go say, oh, my columbines, oh, my hostas. So those shaded areas, right? Or areas protected from the wind, they might not need as much water. You may only need to water twice a week versus that place on the street. You're like, oh boy, I can barely get by with 3 days a week. I better get rid of those Shasta daisies or those echinaceas, because they start to do this at the end of the day. It's just not the right place, not the right plant for that place. So when planning and picking out your plants, you use that combination of evaluating your site, you know, for the sun, the wind, and everything we did in the exercise 2 weeks ago. And then you combine it with like what plants will go there. And oftentimes we're limited by everything being on the same irrigation zone. So everything's getting watered 3 days a week or for the same amount of time. So you kind of want to think about like that lawn is going to probably that sunny lawn where that beautiful dog is playing. My dog wants, you know, it wants that water every 3 days. But this hydro zone on your right is got, you know, very low water needs. It's got plants that are adapted to like the high plains. It's got Russian sage and catmint and wall germander and plants that we've been experimenting with out front here. Some of it has been off irrigation sent until like mid-July and it's doing fine. So it's selecting plants that like to dry out, that don't need the water as often. So hydrozoning is a great way for planting your garden and really dialing in your irrigation so you're only watering what you need to. And the plants are healthier if they're getting the right amount of sun and water that they need too, right? And speaking of sun, we just wanted to throw out some definitions of what sun actually is. And I was really surprised when I got one of those light meters and stuck it in to a thought that I thought was a full sun place, which is 6 hours or more. And it was like part shade. And so part sun, part shade, that's 4 to 6 hours. And so no wonder some of the plants I picked weren't blooming as well as they were in my neighbor's yard. It wasn't 6 hours of sun or more. So, and then the other designation is shade, and this is not the same as deep shade. That's just less than 4 hours. There are special plants that can survive in deep shade, which is like no light, just kind of some reflected light. So when picking your plants, you know, check their requirements, do your research online, check your garden books. Not just water requirements is important, but also sun exposure. And Kathy, thank you for introducing microclimates because it is so very important. Having a feature in your landscape, for example, like this low rock wall can really influence what you can plant next to it. So on the left side, you'll see that gets the full sun, that rock wall, it just thermal loads that sun throughout the day. And throughout the night, it releases that, you know, that warmth into the soil. So the plants, they don't get that 30-degree freeze that we're talking about. Like, okay, I'm shutting down, it's too cold here. So that might be an opportunity to do a hydro zone that is low water. Like the last picture we saw. And this is fun. And then the shade on the other side of the wall, you know, that maybe that's your opportunity to have, and it's cooler, still warm, but opportunity to have flowering shade perennials. This little illustration of this little squirrel right here is real important because how wind functions in our landscape, it, you know, not only whips around the corner, but also as it has energy flowing over the top of your home, especially if it's second story or if you have a group of conifer trees. When it gets to that open space on the other side of that high point, you get like this wind eddy and like all the snow drops out there. And it really can change the landscape because not only do we think about sun, water, soil, our preferences, but what can survive under a whole bunch of snow. Like that's not the spot on my side of the house that I plant a Japanese maple. Yes, it's protected from the wind, but it would get squished by all that snow dropping off on the other side of the house. So microclimates are fun. If you find a spot in your yard that is extra warm or extra shady and your plant needs that, you can move the plant there if it's not doing well, you know, after you start noticing these microclimates more. Benefits of native plants is important in our plant selection because they do so well here. And there are some beautiful ones like this Sierra Currant image on the right. It's tough as nails. I used to work at a nursery, and people that were like, I don't have a green thumb. Nothing grows here. We're like, come over here to the currants, This is a great choice for understory environment. It can survive on very little water. It's a beautiful native. It attracts, hummingbirds and bees as it's flowering. The berries turn blue and the robins come and bounce all over your bush. It's a great habitat plant. And it has gorgeous fall color. One of the first plants to like pop out in the spring, it sets its leaf buds in the fall. And you think, oh, is it starting to grow? Is it starting to grow? Oh no. But they just stay dormant and it's like green right away. Who doesn't love that bright green after a long winter? So we talked about them supporting the local pollinators. They fit into our environment. And if you can't find the natives, there's like nearly natives, we call them, or climate appropriate or Tahoe adapted plants. There's a lot of good close cousins that fit well into our Tahoe friendly landscape. Another benefit is they're suited for this environment in our soil, so they don't need external inputs like fertilizers that we have to be so careful with phosphorus in our landscape, so we can keep the lake clarity pristine. And they're naturally disease resistant. Who doesn't love that? So there's some examples of the different plants that fit in the hydrozones, and we're using natives for this next 3 slides. And these are, like I said, we're going to share these slides, so you'll have the names of these beautiful plants like the silver-flowered buckwheat, the California fuchsia. Moonshine yarrow is a nearly native. The firecracker penstemon that's blooming over where you drop off your bill when you drove in, that is amazing. That grows in places with no water, except for what's available in the environment. The bearberry, which is that prostate manzanita, and then the blanket flower that's native to the West. I mean, who doesn't love those? So, and then we have another category, which is low water use. And then we have some examples here. Wildflowers. You can get wildflower mixes that are fitted into this category from our local resources, comstockseeds.com on the side. And you can pick their pre-mixes on their website or even customize a blend. And they will UPS it right to your house with wonderful instructions on their website and how to establish them. A lot of people kind of have boohoo to wildflowers because I've been trying for years. I've been throwing them out, and I don't know, the squirrels eat them, the birds eat them. But with some establishment instructions available, you can be successful, especially in a year like this where we had a lot of moisture in the spring. Native shrubs are also a very good choice. And this is a image of that beautiful Oregon grape that blooms the yellow about the same time the daffodils do in the garden. There's a native that's a little taller, but there's a plains version that's low growing, which reseeds and spreads in your landscape and naturalizes, and those beautiful berries. I didn't enhance that photo. And again, the Sierra currant fits in this low water category. And then we're not going to do high water because we're at the public utility district. We're talking about water conservation, but moderate water use plants definitely have a place in your land. And some of you live in areas that have more moisture in your soil as well, if you're down by the meadow or the river or the lake. And that's where you're going to see like dogwoods thriving, elderberries, but those are still high water use plants, so we didn't include them in our discussion. Dogwood can be drought tolerant, but just won't thrive without regular water. It'll be small and scraggly. So some moderate use examples is the cream bush, also called ocean spray, and that's the white flowers. And below that, the Western columbine, so beautiful. If you've been out on the trails, you'll see them blooming now. The twinberry next, and then below it, the vine maple, which is native to the lower Cascades. just north of us. In the middle is the service berry. You see that blooming in the spring on the edge of the meadow in the forest. And then when you do road cuts, that kind of creates that same environment. They like the shelter of the forest, but the sun exposure. And then lupins of all varieties grow in Tahoe. What you can find in the nursery is typically the big leaf lupin or the hybrids, which do fantastic here. And then chokecherry is one of my favorite fall color plants. We do have one that we planted in our demonstration garden here, and it always catches my eye in October. So Kathy is going to start talking about some special plants outside of these hydrozones. And she mentioned season extenders. So why don't you come on over?
Okay. If like me, you want a garden that has some sort of color interest or texture interest, or well, we'll leave it at that for right now. Or then I like to plant things in the garden that also extend the bloom season. The plants here would be what I would call spring plants, or plants that bloom fairly early. And the chokecherry is a fairly large tree that grows very quickly, that has wonderful white fragrant flowers in the spring. And two different color leaves. The leaves come out green and then turn purple. So it's quite an interesting plant. And as an added feature in the summer, it has, or late summer, it has berries, and which also make it a really good habitat plant if you want to attract birds. The sand cherry blooms early. It has nice little white flowers and purple foliage. If one of your color themes, or if your color themes tend to be like purple and possibly a real sharp contrast, a light green or a lime, then the sand cherry is a good choice. It also has berries in the summer. Again, a nice habitat plant. Forsythia is not a native, but it has a marvelous burst of bright yellow in the spring, which goes with those daffodils and that are also out at that time. And the blooms actually last quite a while. Jen has already talked about Oregon grape. Here's a picture of the spring blossoms that then turn again to dark blueberries for the birds. And the perennials on the bottom are all spring bloomers, and they're some of my favorites, so that's why they're here. But anyway, bugloss or brunera reseeds prolifically. So if you have one or two, you will soon have a nice mass of these forget-me-not blue flowers with beautiful heart-shaped leaves. So even without the flowers, you have a wonderful decorative low-growing garden plant because of the shape of the leaf. Wood anemone is beautiful and surprisingly hardy as well. It has white flowers, small white flower, not small, they're medium-sized flowers. These three thrive in a part shade to shade environment. So even though you don't have a lot of light, you can still have, a lovely spring bloom. And of course, all of these go really well with our spring bulbs. And this is a snowdrop. It comes up in the snow, actually, in my yard, because it's growing in one of those cold sinks. So the snow is still lingering when these come out. And they're very delicate, but they're very hardy. So early bloomers to berries in the summer, and late bloomers, in addition to fall color, there's also plants that bloom later and keep your habitat garden going a little bit longer. You've got the California fuchsia, which Jen has showed you before in terms of water needs. But this is a real hummingbird magnet. Goldenrod blooms later and is a bumblebee magnet. Sedum, this is autumn joy. It also attracts pollinators. And this is Hydrangea paniculata. It sneaked in even though it has slightly above moderate water needs. But those of you who are familiar with the big blue puffy hydrangeas that you might have grown up with, unfortunately, those don't grow here unless they're in a very protected microclimate. And I have seen places here in South Lake and on East Shore where I have seen the traditional hydrangeas of our youth, I guess, my youth. But this is called Hydrangea paniculata or paniculate, did you call it, Jen? Panicle hydrangea. It's very common on the East Coast, but it grows very well here because the flowers grow on new wood, whereas in the traditional hydrangeas, they grow on old wood, and because of our snow load, those branches are usually crushed, and so there's no possibility for flowers. This one, however, is just a wonder. And one of my favorites is called Limelight because it starts out white. No, it starts out green, turns white, then pink, then deep burgundy. So it's really a wonderful plant. Then, of course, moving on to fall color, I'm sure you all recognize these. The vine maple, the native maple from the Cascades, has a beautiful red-orange color. The chokeberry or aronia berry turns a beautiful red. And the dogwood, if you have dogwoods turn a wonderful deep burgundy color. Sometimes they're also an orangey color, depending on how much sun they get and how much water they get. But this way you can have plants here at Tahoe, colorful gardens from like June or when it, God bless you, whenever the snow melts to whenever the snow falls again. And usually, you know, our big peak is in July, but there are ways like by plant choice to extend the color in your garden and extend the habitat for wildlife. Whoops. Let's see here. Speaking of habitat, here we go. The shrubs and trees that you choose will attract birds, and because they will provide them with food, water, shelter, and nesting. And if you this is something a lawn cannot provide you. There's much more diversity in your garden, depending, you know, if you choose shrubs and trees that have a seasonal interest, you know, especially with berries. This happens to be, I think it's Hall's honeysuckle, which likes a nice sunny spot. Okay, I think Jen is actually my guru for attracting birds. She has bird houses in her landscape that are you know, it's like the birds compete for them. So it's a very attractive place. Also, many people say, "Oh, I want a butterfly garden." Well, I'm broadening that term to a pollinator garden because uh, you can have both a sun or shade pollinator garden. Jen was just telling me about sitting in her garden, which in the evening and watching the bees and the sphinx moth come and pollinate the plants in her garden there. The Xerxes Society is a really good source for plants and how that attract pollinators. And some of the major characteristics of a pollinator or a garden would be plant as many native perennials as you can, make sure it's protected from the wind, and massing is really good, and a variety of plants. And of course, you don't want to use any pesticides or herbicides because you might kill your pollinators that way. Not a good thing. So Jen is going to talk to you about the size of your plants.
Kathy. So again, my urge is to like want an instant landscape, like planting everything close together, having that instant impact, right? But then 5 years down the line, I'm like, oh boy, what have I gotten myself into? Now, like when the rain comes, like the bush would be hanging over in the walkway, getting my pants wet on the way to the front door, or I'd be running into it when I was opening my car door in the driveway, or it'd be blocking the view of a plant in the back that I really wanted. So understanding like the form and the mature size of the plant in your environment, no, that's kind of hard, but we get better at it with practice, is really important in our landscape design. So taking the time to maybe check a couple different resources on how big that plant actually gets, and then maybe seeing how it's growing in your neighborhood and in neighboring landscapes or in the wild is a really good thing to observe and to collect information from. Also for water conservation, I mean, if you have a really dense landscape of moderate water need plants, if you do convert your turf to that kind of design, you could still be using quite a bit of water. So think about density as well at maturity, as well as like plant size at maturity, if you're wanting to budget your water use in your landscape. So a little bit on that. Kathy is now going to talk about design guidelines, and she has some beautiful slides. And this is the part where the landscape designer in her really shines. So thank you for coming up and talking about that. We've got another maybe 10 minutes of talking before we get to an activity. We'll be able to answer questions as well.
As I just want to add one thing to the size of plants. I can't tell you how I cringe when I when I walk by a property where a beautiful maple tree with a 20-foot spread, right, in its natural environment, has been planted 3 feet from a fence. And neither, if that were my yard, neither the plant nor I would be happy. So I just don't do it. Okay. Anyway, what I use as guidelines when I'm choosing plants is in a planting bed. You can see here, there's you want to make sure that not just your sight, your sense of sight, and your sense of smell are engaged in your garden. We'll look at ways to engage all of the senses. We talked a little bit earlier about massing plants for impact. Before I got into garden design, I had a real strong urge for onesitis. I wanted one of everything I saw in the nursery. However, that kind of eclecticism doesn't necessarily translate into a unified design. So planting more than one plant and planting your plants in odd numbers is somehow much more pleasing to the aesthetic sense than otherwise. Contrast and is also important in the garden. We'll talk about contrast not only in color, but other types of contrast as well. You don't want, you want to create a unified garden, even if your planting beds are in various places in your landscape. You'd like to have a sense of unity. It's somehow very comforting, and it also moves the eye through the garden. focal points are also important, whether they're in a planting bed or in the general landscape. And also, you want to think about your style. Do you like a more formal style, a more informal style, a very sparse landscape with very few plants and more boulders? Do you prefer straight lines and symmetrical plantings, or do you like a more curved line? I've often heard that there are no straight lines in nature. So, but if you go to the formal gardens in both in this country and in Europe, you'll see quite, they give quite a different sense of design because they're very symmetrical. So let's take a closer look at how to engage the senses. Sight, sound, touch, and smell. And of course, I love roses, so fragrance is of primary importance to me, even though roses, unless you have a really sunny spot here, are very impractical. But anyway, I love them, so I have them. So let's look at how, of course, in addition to color, you want to think of movement in your garden. The grasses are a wonderful way to bring movement into the garden, especially if you've got a windy spot. Let's see. Okay, movement. Movement is also created by different heights and different shapes of plants as well. But because it moves your eye through the garden. Sound, what do you hear when you go into your garden? Do you have gurgling water or maybe a pond? Do you have wind chimes? Do you have something that, besides a barking dog, that will draw you into the garden and perhaps mask street noise or the neighbor's buzzsaw or yeah, I learned a lot about this in Japan because almost all gardens in Japan, except for the rock gardens, have a water feature, even if it's just an intermittent clack of the bamboo on as the water goes through the fountain. It focuses you from and mitigates any outside noises. It's very relaxing. How about touch? If you have kids, well, you might not want to have too many spiky things in the garden if you have kids, but texture, if you like lamb's ears, the touching the soft fuzzy lamb's ears is really fun. A very fine textured fern, and also the artemisia over here, or a type of sage on the right-hand side. You can see that it's a very soft and fine textured plant. That would be much more comfortable to touch than the grass in the middle, which is kind of pokey. But it has its place for its vertical movement. Of course, we all know about roses, honeysuckle, all of these plants that are very fragrant. Some plants like herbs like rosemary and mint, if you touch them, and lavender, it smells wonderful. So it's not just flowers that have fragrance, it's also the leaves. Now, the next principle that I keep in mind, as we've already mentioned it, is massing plants. This is great not only for pollinators because they don't have to work as hard to access the pollen or the nectar, but it also is very pleasing for the eye. And as I mentioned before, the use of odd numbers is much more aesthetically pleasing than planting in even numbers. So 3, 5, 7. If you are grouping plants or shrubs, then those would be the combinations you'd want to go for. You also want to think of contrast. Of course, we think of contrasts in color. Or do you want a more restful garden? But contrast is, flowers don't last forever. So one way to think about contrast in your garden is in not only the shape of plants, round, tall, draping. Each of these has its place to give character to your garden. But when you're planting a bed, a really important thing to remember is you want to plant. Here it's tall to small, but I would go the other way. Like your shorter plants will be in the front, like not a ground cover, but a low plant, like, and then your mid-level plant, and then maybe your shrubs in the background. That would be the sequence that, well, like that you can see. Let me see if I can get this to work. A sequence you see here too: lower plants, mid plants, higher plants. And in the traditional English gardens, that's one of the features they usually use. You also want to look for contrast in leaf shape and texture. In shade gardens, particularly where there's not a whole lot of flower color, the use of variegated leaves or leaves with or lighter colored leaves contrasting with the darker, smaller, finer textured leaves can add life to a dark corner. And also, I already briefly talked about shapes, but here you can see kind of a tumbling plant next to a really tall, upright plant. So this kind of contrast, again, moves the eye through the garden and creates a nice sense of, interestingly enough, unity, which we're going to look at. What you want to do with all of these shapes and colors is repeat color, height, texture, and shape. Like you might have a section of a garden that has a certain color combination and combination of textures and contrast. If you could just kind of use that as a template and repeat it throughout whatever garden space you're working with. Again, you can see the lower plants in the front, the mid-level plants, and then a higher plant. You can also see a repetition in color or tone. This is not a hot garden particularly because the colors are fairly soft. But the patterns here can easily be repeated in your various beds. Also, and this is primarily outside of your planting beds, but in your landscape, you want to plan for focal points. And what draws the eye out of your kitchen window, for example, not just to people who are passing on the curb, but you, if you're standing in, I spend a lot of time in my kitchen sink, so I want something really nice to look at when I look at that window. Or if, in just at the edge of your gathering area, you might want your eye to focus on a particularly beautiful and colorful plant. Focus points can also hide something in the back that you don't want people to look at. Their eye will be drawn to the focal point and not what's behind it. A water feature can also be a focal point in the yard, as well as providing sound for your senses. Okay. As you think about putting all of that stuff together, you also want to think about your style. I talked about it a little bit earlier. Are you someone who likes straight lines, symmetry, and defined spaces? That would be a much more formal style. Or are you looking for a more informal garden with curved lines and a little bit more wildness? You know, and you can combine them in different parts of your garden. Your front yard, for example, might be very formal. Your backyard might be very informal, depending on where you spend your time. Okay, of course, remember to add personal whimsy, no matter what your style is. Yeah, it's like, what was your latest find at the thrift store? Or, you know, what kind of, whoops, what kind of birdhouses that will never be inhabited by a bird do you want to put on your fence? Or just, there's so much you can use, so much garden art available that's really, you know, what suits your character and your sense of whimsy. Okay. Is this your part, Jen?
Yes.
Okay, then.
It is. Thank you. So just remember, a perennial shrub doesn't have to thrive where you planted it, right? Because we learn by doing. So it's okay. Just try to evaluate the unhappiness and why, and try to find its happy place. I like the happy place. Spring, if you are doing transplants, spring and fall when it's not super hot is the best time, because the roots end up getting a little damaged, right? When you're digging it out. All the fine roots at the end might break. So be kind to it. And it could be not be thriving. It could be a fine location. It just could be that the planting hole or planting bed wasn't prepared well enough. So you might go back, dig out, and then turn in a lot more compost. So, I mean, how to plant is a whole nother topic, but that could have something to do with why your plant isn't thriving. So before we get started on the design activity, I wanted to make sure the folks that have joined us, calling in from home, know that there's a chance for me to review their plans. So if they email those to me, and I'll have their emails because Lauren, my technical assistant, is collecting them. They can participate as well. So some of you came, how many people came with a site kind of plan analysis? Okay, that's great, because if you want to take the next step and start looking at garden design, you've already done that part, and we can be here to help with that. But if you're joining us for the first time or you're just busy, let's just start from scratch at the beginning. So I put this kind of a summary next of what we were looking at, putting it all together just as a reminder. And these are the things that we think about when we're first analyzing our site and kind of thinking about the challenges and the opportunities. Then we mark off our open spaces, our gathering areas, our activity zones. We connect the spaces, and then we have the garden beds to play with. So I will leave that up. Also, if you're here today or joining us virtually, if you're one of our water or sewer customers, you can sign up for a WaterWise landscaping consultation. And that's the best part of my job, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, is to be able to meet with you one-on-one and talk about your garden, and help you get through some of your hurdles or challenges, brainstorm with you. Also be able to do things like evaluate your irrigation if that's what you're wanting, maybe help you with scheduling or operating your timer in a way that works better for you. We also do a rebate for upgrading to like WaterWise irrigation timers, ones that look at the local weather or the soil moisture. It's $100 rebate. And how many of you know about our turf buyback program? Pretty much everybody?
No, nothing.
Okay, yeah. Well, I'm available to talk about that too, because we offer, while funding is available, $1.50 per square foot, if you are enrolled and are accepted in the program, to convert some of that more high water intense landscape to something more Tahoe friendly that uses less water. And I do have like a handout of the program requirements with me if you come talk to me. and I can summarize it in a simple way versus reading through a 2-page document. So, any questions at this time? Yes.
Budget first. Where you think about any of this stuff, and then talk to the experts like yourself and Matthew, and trying to figure out with whatever budget. Whether this is the things that you're showing are really intense. And when I have a house that's like 9 years old, I didn't do anything for several years, we're having travel, spending money,
No.
you know, shunned by my neighbors.
Right.
And so when I decided to do something 2 years ago, it's like everybody came in, I got 3 or 4 professional bids. I think from some of the people that you mentioned. And it was like 60,000, 50, 60,000. So
Wow.
like randomly over 10,000 square foot lot, which is pretty standard size, right?
Right.
I said, I'm not spending 60,000. I ended up spending 30, and the guy hated me by the time he left. I said, cheap, you know. So I would say my yard is pretty simple, really.
And I simple is good for water conservation.
Biggest water offenders in the community.
Oh, okay.
A lot of grass and my intention was start cutting it back and convert it. It's just easier to cover it. And so that's got me here. So I don't want to need rest.
Yeah.
So you know,
Yeah, we've got here tonight. We did actually end up cutting quite a few slides that we're going to save for like another presentation, and a lot of it was a maintenance, budget considerations, you know, soil preparation, all that. But in these 4 classes, we're really trying to capture the basics of turf conversion was the first one. And then like how you guys could maybe come up with a design that maybe could be implemented, either a DIY job or not, you know, something that's more budget friendly. Because those bids,
do yourself jobs. I mean, they're huge, beautiful house and gardens and things.
right?
That would cost a lot of money.
Yeah, and this isn't an inspiration class for you. Well, thank you
And I
for
would
bringing that.
mention this to the people in here, we all have our yards already, and so we're really tweaking. We're starting with the blank palette. You know, like I did several years ago, I knew that excavation,
Hmm.
irrigation systems,
Start.
pathways, walkways.
Okay, well, thank you for that feedback, and we're always looking for ideas for new topics for classes that we try to get through in an hour and a half at a time. So yeah, sometimes we do have to piecemeal them, and in the past, we have done a class on kind of maintenance and budget, that kind of planning.
Well, I'll just jump in on budget. If you have such an extensive project, you can even if and you want to stay within budget and you want to spread it out, you can phase your project to do certain types of planting or certain infrastructure things first. I know it's hard to wait, and then do planting in phases rather than all at once. And that can help mitigate the pain of on the pocket.
And that's where I'm at right now. I just want to try and get the front. I'd like to do the front before, and that would be just a practical question. When should we stop planting? Do we plant to the end of this month and still not risk the plants to survive?
It would be better not to plant right now, as a matter of fact. The best time to plant is in the fall. So that's another advantage because if you need to phase things and you can't find a landscape installer to come until later in the season, not all is lost because the best time for root growth and the health of the plant, whether it's a shrub or a perennial or a tree, is to actually plant in the fall, September, October. And you'll see that the nursery, and it's also a good time because the nurseries often have sales then. And you can really cut down on the price of your planting material by planting in the fall.
That almost
It's
sounds-
way too hot right now.
To me, so you're saying that if you plant like in the middle of September and late September, the root systems, all those that stuff are gonna, within several weeks before it starts freezing, because usually by the end of October, it's cold.
Right, but the ground stays warmer.
Uh-huh.
It's like, if you plant in the summer, the plants are competing between roots and shoots, right? And in the fall, they're concentrating on growing their, the root system. And so you're gonna have a stronger plant in the spring if you plant in the fall here. Yeah, yeah.
I just.
Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, go ahead. Okay, I was just wondering, because of the huge snow load that we do have in winter, is there a way you can make up to protect the new plants through the first winter, like burlap or some kind of structure?
Yeah.
Protective, I mean, think of this past winter.
Yeah. I know. Well, in the first place, you want to try to avoid planting your plants in your heavy, snow load zones. Especially shrubs or, small trees that you can wrap them, and that does help. Okay, so don't plant them in a heavy snow load zone or where it falls off your roof or where your wind eddies build up heavy snow. Wrap your plants, use burlap.
Shrubs, trees, small,
Pardon?
right? Just the shrubs and trees.
Yeah, just the shrubs and trees.
Because perennials are great there.
Yes,
They just
Correct, yeah.
go to sleep and die to the ground. Yeah.
yeah, I have peonies next to my driveway because they die down completely in the winter, but they come back up, with their beautiful foliage, and sometimes if I'm lucky, I get blossoms in the spring. But again, that's, they go totally flat and I don't have to wrap them or anything like that. But teepees are always good. Teepees with burlap are good. Cages filled with leaves are good in addition to wrapping. Yes,
Lydia?
When is the best time to prune?
It depends on when your shrub blooms. So like the hydrangea that Kathy was speaking of, and lilacs that bloom in the summer on new, it depends. If it's blooming on new wood, you don't want to cut off that new wood at the beginning in spring and then they won't blossom. They started to grow, they started to set buds and then you cut it. Instead, you cut those in the fall when they're done blooming. But like hydrangeas, they bloom on old wood. So, yeah, it depends, and you need to look them up or give me a call and I'll look it up for you. Yeah, and even with spirea, some of them bloom on new wood, some of them bloom on old wood. So the timing depends. You could always prune dead or diseased branches, and you can always prune for defensible space anytime. Yeah.
okay, was there another question?
Yeah, I'm
here?
gonna actually, my question was for Tina, but following up on her, giving you an example. I have these several beautiful red tree dogwoods, and for years and years and years and years, and I've gone out and done this and got myself dizzy wrapping them and everything, and then because like everybody here, we had that first 2 feet, November 1st, the day after Halloween, which continued until 2 months ago. I never had an opportunity to wrap anything. So my specific question is, it didn't seem to make a difference. They're doing great. And they were kaputzi. Match.
Yeah, there's some shrubs.
As opposed to,
Yeah, if you can tolerate your shrubs, your dogwoods not being 10 feet tall, like some people want to do that for a visual screen and let them just flex under the snow, they might just get a little wider. And if you kind of routinely cut out the oldest wood that isn't as attractive, doesn't have the red stems, never more than typically it's never more than 1/3, and you cut the canes all the way to the ground, then it's going to have that flexible, soft, pliant branches.
which is what they are. I've had them at least 10 years.
And then same thing with willows, same thing with some other plant species that don't need wrapping, low maintenance. I mean, I let them all go except for my new Japanese maple, but. And
So
and
basically,
they're beautiful.
don't bother wrapping stuff. If all this was unwrapped last winter.
If you can tolerate it, yeah, if you can tolerate it being wider or not so tall or getting some breakage. I mean, when I had a lot of breakage in my currants, which are excellent snow load plants, I cut the broken ones and there was just a flush of new branches right in the middle. Just like it was saying, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for pruning me. I needed this. So
And then.
right plant, right place takes the snow load, right?
Yeah, my original question was, just last Friday, I went to Tahoe Outdoor Living and saw some beautiful hydrangeas. There's, for some reason, the Japanese burberries over the last couple of years, I'm done. They were going out and they were just completely finished. So it's only two plants. My specific question is, I don't know how big those buckets are. What, Jennifer, what size is this?
Well, they often sell 5 gallons as 4 gallons.
Okay, so let's say
4 gallons.
5 gallon bucket. So here's my question now. Is, of course, I wanted to buy them right then and there, but I got my bicycle, so karma safety. Is because it's best to plant either early spring or I've learned fall, because early spring, the ground is still frozen and everything else. And then all of a sudden you get to it 2 weeks later and now it's 85 degrees. The
True.
specific question is, if I would purchase a couple 5 gallon buckets, but I have no intentions of planting them, putting them in the ground until 6 weeks from now, are they gonna outgrow that bucket and then they're just gonna be like, wow, I really needed some space and you didn't give it to me?
Only if you're buying like root bound plants.
Only by what?
If you're collecting root bound plants, like just like that thing, like get smaller plants that aren't like, we tend to want to get, oh, this is so huge and it's just, oh, and it's just 1 gallon. You know, what a good price. But really, those roots are probably starting to circle the drain because there's not enough room for them to grow out.
Mhm.
So if you're buying quality plant material, you can certainly put it in like a larger pot or keep that black pot out of the sun if it's a shade plant, because the heat on that black nursery pot could superheat the soil and damage your roots. So, but you can buy plants and nurture them along just like we do at the nursery.
I was gonna say, I mean, these plants, some of them have to be at the nursery for 2 months in that same
Yeah.
container.
Yeah, and sometimes they're watered twice a day because that container's so small and it's hot and might be in the sun. So if you baby them along, they're putting most of their energy into canopy, the shoots, like Kathy said, because you know they need to reproduce, they need to fruit and whatnot, and then as they go dormant, all that energy goes down to root development. And that's what's so great about planting in the fall, because they can
Yeah.
develop roots in the fall and the spring before the heat of the summer, where they start sending their energy up. They have
So-
more resources to gather.
So basically, the specific answer to my question is, go ahead.
It depends.
Find something, just make sure you look at the bottom and the roots aren't coming out and all that. But
Feel it.
It's okay to leave it in that thing, just make sure it's well watered and in shade.
Yeah, or not in morning sun, just don't let that pot bake.
Well, you know where I'm,
Yeah, yeah.
not a problem with sun there.
So, it's, those were really good questions, and I think we need to plan accordingly for more questions and shorter presentations of information. I would love to be able to go over your plans with you. We have 5 minutes to do that now, but I can schedule a time to meet you either here or at your home. If you're in one of our customers, I think, is anybody not a water sewer customer? Bye, Lydia. Okay, great. I think we can work that out. Thank you all for coming. I put up on here our next presentation. the 22nd. It's gonna be fun. It's gonna be on irrigation. And if you have any questions before the next class, feel free to contact me. My business card is on the back table, and there's more information on our website as well. Sign up for the turf buyback program if you're thinking about converting your turf. It's a great opportunity to play and diversify your landscape. Some of the resources on the back table was a planting list developed by the master gardeners, divided into type and sun exposure. Ground covers are so popular because they can serve as an erosion control measure and can be a good choice for defensible space. So I got this great publication from Northern Arizona. All the plants on there do well here. Today, I did an all-day defensible space training with the fire districts, and I was able to snag a inspection form that I wrote sample only on, because when you call them to maybe mark one of your trees for removal, they also do a defensible space inspection. So it's nice to be prepared. And then you can study this and have some questions ready for them. There's 4 new inspectors in town as of today. And another just a general handout on water efficient landscaping and choosing the right plants for Northern Nevada high fires at hazard zones. I do have some home landscaping guides. If we're out of them, I have 4 back here. That's the big blue book. That's been in circulation since 2008. And there's also a green booklet in the back on how to manage your native plants in your landscape in a fire safe way. So help yourself.